The window was already open when Julian Ashworth woke. Not fully open, just enough for cold air to slide across his face like a warning. He did not reach for the bell pull. He did not call for his footman. He rose from the bed in silence, bare feet on cold wood, and crossed the room toward the sound that had woken him, fabric scraping against stone. A woman was climbing out of his window. She had one leg over the sill already, skirts bunched high around her knee, both hands white-knuckled on the frame. Her hair had come loose from its pins on one side, falling across her face in a dark curtain. She did not see him yet. She was too busy fighting with her own hem, which had caught on a nail somewhere near the latch. Julian stopped 3 steps away and said nothing at first. He simply watched. There was something almost impressive about the determination in her movements, the way she yanked at the fabric like it had personally wronged her. Then she looked up and saw him. She went completely still. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The candle on his nightstand had burned low, casting more shadow than light, but it was enough for him to see her face clearly. Wide eyes, a torn sleeve at the shoulder, the kind of tear that comes from being grabbed, not from snagging on furniture. Her breath came fast and uneven. "Wrong room," she whispered. It was such a strange thing to say, and she said it so calmly that for a heartbeat Julian almost believed her, as if she had simply lost her way in the corridor and ended up climbing out the wrong casement by mistake, the way one might knock on the wrong door. Then she started swinging her other leg through the window. "Stop," Julian said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that came from a lifetime of being obeyed without needing to raise it. The woman froze, one leg still hooked over the sill, halfway between his room and the 3-story drop beyond it. "I would rather not stop," she said. Her voice shook slightly, though she was clearly trying to keep it steady. "I would rather be somewhere else. Anywhere else. If it is all the same to you." "It is not all the same to me," Julian said. "You are in my bedroom in the middle of the night, and you are bleeding." She blinked, glanced down at her own hand, and seemed surprised to find a thin line of red across her palm, where she must have cut it on the latch or the nail. She stared at it like it belonged to someone else. "That is inconvenient," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Julian took 1 step closer. She flinched, the whole leg going rigid, and he stopped immediately. He had seen that flinch before, on soldiers who had come home from war, and on servants who had come from worse households than his own. It was not the flinch of someone startled. It was the flinch of someone who expected to be hurt and was bracing for it out of habit. "I am not going to touch you," he said. "I am going to ask you a question, and you may answer it or not, but either way, I would like you to come back inside before you fall and break your neck on my property, which would create a great deal of paperwork for me." Something that might have been a laugh, or might have been a sob, escaped her before she could stop it. "How very practical of you," she said. "I am told it is my worst quality." She considered him for a long moment. Whatever she saw in his face, and Julian had no idea what that was, since he was not a man given to expressive features, seemed to settle something in her. Slowly, carefully, she brought her leg back over the sill and stood inside his room instead of outside it. "Whose room did you intend to escape from?" Julian asked. She did not answer. Instead, her eyes moved to the small writing desk near the window, and specifically, to a single dropped hairpin lying on the rug beside it, one she must have lost during her climb. She crossed to it immediately, crouched down, and picked it up with the kind of focus a person might give to a family heirloom, not a bent piece of metal worth less than a candle stub. Julian watched her turn it over in her fingers 3 times before tucking it carefully into her palm. "That is an unusual thing to care about right now," he said. "It is the only thing I currently have any control over," she said, without looking up. He did not press further. He simply walked to the window and closed it, quietly, with her still standing inside. "My name is Julian Ashworth," he said. "This is my house, and as of a moment ago, apparently my problem. I did not ask to be anyone's problem." "No," he agreed. "You rarely do, I imagine." She straightened, tucking the hairpin against her palm, and studied him properly for the first time, not with fear this time, but with something more careful, more assessing, the look of someone deciding how much danger a room actually contained. "Evangeline Thorne," she said finally. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Eve, Eve," Julian repeated. "You still have not told me whose room you were climbing out of." Her jaw tightened. For a moment he thought she would refuse to answer at all. Then quietly she said, "The room 2 doors down." "Belonging to a Mr. Crane." Julian's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very cold and very still. "Pelham Crane," he said. "You know him. He is the brother of the woman I invited to stay this week." "I did not invite him. He invited himself," Eve said, and there was a bitterness in her voice now that had not been there a moment ago, as men like him tend to do. Julian looked at the torn sleeve again. He looked at the cut on her hand. He looked at the door of his room, which was still closed, still locked from the inside the way he always locked it, meaning she had not come through the corridor at all. She had come along the ledge, 3 floors up, in the dark, rather than walk past a closed door. "You climbed along the ledge," he said slowly, "rather than walk down the hallway." The hallway had him in it. The simplicity of that sentence did more to Julian than any explanation could have. He said nothing for a moment, turning it over the way she had turned over the hairpin. "You will not be going back to that room tonight," he said finally. "I was not planning to. You were planning to climb down 3 floors in the dark instead. I have done stranger things for less reason." Julian almost smiled. Almost. It surfaced somewhere near the corner of his mouth, and then thought better of itself and retreated. "There is a guest room at the end of this corridor," he said. "It has a working lock. I will have a maid bring you fresh linens and something for that cut. You do not need to trouble yourself." "I am already troubled," Julian said. "The trouble occurred the moment you decided my window was an acceptable exit route. I am simply managing the situation efficiently." Eve studied him again, and this time something flickered at the edge of her mouth that was almost, but not quite, a smile. "How efficient of you," she said. "I am told that is also my worst quality." She did not laugh, but the tension in her shoulders eased by some small, measurable degree. Julian noticed it, the way he noticed everything, carefully, and without saying so. He led her out of his room and down the corridor, 1 candle between them, and when they reached the guest room he opened the door and stood back to let her enter first. She hesitated at the threshold, glancing back at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You do not know me. I climbed through your window in the middle of the night. Any reasonable man would have called for the constable." "I am not always a reasonable man," Julian said. "Ask my aunt." "That is not an answer." He considered this. It was, he realized, a fair complaint. "You looked like someone who has spent a great deal of time making sure no one ever had to trouble themselves over you," he said finally. "I find I would like to be the exception to that, tonight at least." Eve did not answer. She stepped into the room, and Julian closed the door behind her, and stood in the corridor for a long moment afterward, listening to nothing at all, before returning to his own room and the window he now intended to keep locked for the rest of the night. He did not sleep again before dawn. He lay awake instead, turning over the sight of her on that ledge, the flinch, the hairpin, the way she had said, "wrong room," as though the words themselves could undo what had almost happened to her. He was a man who managed estates and ledgers and obligations with total control, and he did not enjoy the sensation, now settling in his chest, of something he could not manage at all. By morning, the household staff were already whispering. A woman found leaving the Duke's chambers in the dead of night was the kind of story that traveled faster than any coach could carry it. True or not? Julian heard the first murmurs over breakfast and said nothing to confirm or deny them, which only made the whispering worse. He found Eve in the breakfast room an hour later, seated stiffly at the far end of the table, dressed in a borrowed gown that did not quite fit her shoulders. She had not touched her tea. "You look as though you have not slept," he said, taking the seat across from her. "I have had a great deal to think about, as have I." She glanced up at him, wary again, the way she had been on the ledge. "What have you decided to do with me?" "Nothing has been decided," Julian said, "except that you will remain here as my guest until matters are settled properly. Mr. Crane will not trouble you again. I intend to make certain of that personally." "You do not need to defend my honor, Your Grace. I am quite capable of managing my own affairs." "I am certain you are," Julian said. "I am equally certain that no one should have to manage an affair like this alone, capable or otherwise." Eve's fingers tightened around her teacup, though she still did not drink from it. For a moment, Julian thought she might argue further. Instead, she simply looked at him, searching his face for some catch, some hidden cost to his kindness that she had clearly learned to expect from every man who had ever offered her anything. She did not find one. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle her most of all. The morning passed in careful, formal silence between them, the household staff watching from doorways with poorly hidden curiosity, and neither Julian nor Eve gave them anything more to whisper about. But something had shifted in that room overnight, quiet and unspoken, the way a lock clicks open before anyone notices the door has moved at all. 3 days passed before Julian's aunt arrived, and she arrived the way storms arrive, with no warning and a great deal of noise. Lady Margaret Ashworth swept into the entrance hall trailing a maid, 2 trunks, and a reputation for asking exactly the questions everyone else was too polite to voice aloud. "Julian," she said, removing her gloves, finger by finger, while her eyes swept the hall as though counting the silverware. "There is a rumor circulating in 3 counties that you have taken a woman into your house in the middle of the night and refused to explain why. I have come to hear the explanation myself, since apparently no one else is brave enough to ask for it." "She required assistance," Julian said. "I gave it. There is nothing further to explain. There is a great deal further to explain, and you know it." Lady Margaret handed her gloves to the maid without looking at her. "Where is she?" "In the east, sitting room, I believe." "Then that is where we shall have tea." Eve was indeed in the east sitting room, seated near the window with a book she was not reading, when Lady Margaret entered, like a small, well-dressed hurricane, and sat down across from her without waiting to be invited to do so. "So you are the young woman who has set the entire county talking," Lady Margaret said, studying her with open curiosity rather than judgment, which Eve had not expected. "Evangeline Thorne, is it? Daughter of the late Viscount Thorne?" "The very same," Eve said carefully, "though I imagine you already knew that before you arrived, given how quickly gossip travels through this house. I make it my business to know things quickly. It saves a great deal of embarrassment later." Lady Margaret accepted a cup of tea from the maid and studied Eve over the rim of it. "Your father left considerable debts, if memory serves." Eve's spine straightened. "He did. And you have been working as a companion since his death, to settle what you could of them." "I have. That is either extraordinary loyalty or extraordinary foolishness. I have not yet decided which. Perhaps it is simply the only choice available to a woman with no other inheritance," Eve said, and there was an edge in her voice now, sharp enough that Lady Margaret actually smiled at it, apparently pleased to have provoked something other than polite silence. "Good," she said. "I was beginning to worry my nephew had brought home someone entirely without spine. I see I was wrong." Julian, who had entered the room in time to hear the last exchange, allowed himself the smallest flicker of amusement. "Aunt Margaret, must you interrogate my guests before they have finished their tea?" "I must interrogate them at some point, Julian, and tea seemed the civilized moment to do it." Lady Margaret set down her cup. "Tell me, Miss Thorne, what precisely happened the night you were found leaving my nephew's chambers, since the version currently circulating through 3 counties involves considerably more scandal than I suspect actually occurred." Eve's hands went still in her lap. For a moment, Julian thought she would deflect the question the way she had deflected every question since her arrival, offering some careful half-truth that revealed nothing and satisfied no one. Instead, She looked directly at Lady Margaret and said, "Mr. Crane cornered me in his room under the pretense of returning a book I had lent his sister. When I understood his intentions, I left through the nearest exit available to me, which happened to be a window 3 floors above the ground, because the door required passing directly by him again." The room went very quiet. Lady Margaret's face, for the first time since her arrival, lost its sharp, appraising edge entirely. "I see," she said, and her voice had gone soft in a way Julian had rarely heard from her. "That is rather more serious than the county gossip suggested. The county gossip suggested I was climbing into your nephew's room, not out of someone else's. Yes, people do prefer the more scandalous version of any story, particularly when the true version reflects poorly on a man of standing." Lady Margaret glanced at Julian. "Where is Mr. Crane now?" "Gone," Julian said. "I saw to it personally, the morning after it happened." "Gone where?" "That is no longer my concern, provided he does not return." Lady Margaret studied her nephew for a long moment, something calculating behind her eyes, and then turned back to Eve with an entirely different expression, one that looked almost like respect. "You have my apologies, Miss Thorne, for arriving with suspicion rather than sympathy. I have learned, in my considerable years, that suspicion is often the safer first instinct in this household, but I see it was misplaced this time." "You need not apologize," Eve said quietly. "You are not the first person to assume the worst of me. I imagine you will not be the last." Something in the way she said it, flat and resigned rather than bitter, made Julian's chest tighten in a way he did not have a name for. Lady Margaret left an hour later, considerably softer in her manner than when she had arrived, though she promised to return within the fortnight to, in her words, make certain her nephew had not made a complete disaster of the situation in her absence. That evening, Julian found Eve again in the same sitting room, this time alone, the book still unread in her lap. "You did not have to tell her everything," he said, taking the seat across from her. "She would have found out eventually. Everyone in this house finds out everything eventually. I have learned that much in 3 days." Still, it could not have been easy saying it aloud. Eve looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, grew more open than it had been since her arrival. "It is strange," she said. "I have spent years making myself small enough that men stop looking at me twice, small enough not to be noticed, not to be remembered, not to be worth the trouble of unkindness. And now I am living in a duke's house, being asked direct questions by his terrifying aunt, and I find I do not know how to be looked at anymore. I only know how to disappear." Julian did not respond immediately. He was not a man who filled silences easily, and he had learned enough about Eve in 3 days to know that filling this one with false comfort would only make her retreat further. "I know how to disappear in a room," she continued, quieter now. "I do not know how to be looked at in one." "Then I will not look," Julian said. "I will simply stay in the room." Eve blinked at him, clearly not expecting that answer, and something in her shoulders loosened, just slightly, the way a held breath finally releases. He did not ask about her father's debts that night, though he had already begun quietly making inquiries. He did not ask about Crane's threats, though the details had reached him through his own channels within a day of her arrival. He simply sat with her in comfortable silence while the fire burned low. And when she finally spoke again, it was about nothing important at all: the weather, a book she had once loved, the size of his aunt's traveling trunks, and Julian found he did not mind the smallness of the conversation. He found, in fact, that he preferred it. Over the following days, a quiet rhythm settled between them. Eve began taking her meals in the main dining room rather than requesting a tray in her chambers. She began speaking more freely with the household staff, who had grown fond of her within the week, particularly the young housemaid Margot, who brought her tea each morning without being asked, and lingered afterward to talk about nothing in particular. Julian, for his part, began finding reasons to be in whatever room Eve occupied. He told himself it was concern for her welfare, a natural extension of his responsibility as her host. He did not examine the feeling too closely, because he suspected that if he did, he would not like what the examination revealed about the state of his own carefully managed heart. One evening, nearly a week after her arrival, he found her in his study, standing before the shelf of ledgers he kept meticulously updated every quarter, running her finger along their spines. "You keep a great many records," she observed. "An estate this size requires it." "That is not quite what I meant." She turned to face him, something perceptive in her expression. "I have noticed you retreat to this room whenever something unpleasant occurs elsewhere in the house, as though the numbers offer a kind of order that other things do not." Julian said nothing for a long moment, because she had struck closer to the truth than he was entirely comfortable admitting. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said finally. "After that, I found the ledgers easier to manage than most things." Eve did not offer sympathy, did not fill the silence with the practiced condolences he had heard 100 times from 100 acquaintances. She simply nodded, as though she understood the particular comfort of columns that always balanced, numbers that never demanded more feeling than one chose to give them. "Grief managed is still grief," she said quietly, "even if it looks like arithmetic from the outside." Julian looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them that neither of them named aloud, a recognition of shared exhaustion, shared caution, two people who had each learned to survive by making themselves smaller in their own particular ways. Neither of them spoke of it again that night. But the following morning, when Julian entered his study to find his morning correspondence, he noticed that someone had closed the ledger book he had left open on his desk the evening before, gently, without disturbing a single page, as though someone had decided, quietly and without asking permission, that the numbers could wait one more day. He did not need to ask who had done it. The invitation arrived on a gray morning, carried in by the post, along with a stack of business correspondence that Julian barely glanced at once he saw the seal. Lord and Lady Winterbourne were holding their annual house party at the end of the month, and as was tradition, half the county had been invited, including, inevitably, Julian himself. He almost declined. He had declined the previous 2 years without much thought, preferring the quiet of his own estate to the noise and performance of a crowded house full of people eager to discuss whose daughter had married well and whose fortune had quietly collapsed. But this year, something made him hesitate before writing his refusal. He found Eve in the garden that afternoon, cutting flowers for the dining table, with a pair of shears that looked entirely too large for her hands, and he told her about the invitation before he had fully decided what he intended to do about it. "You should go," she said, without looking up from the roses. "It would look strange if you did not, given how much the county already whispers about this house. I was not asking your permission. I was informing you that you will be coming with me." Eve's shears stopped mid-cut. She looked up at him slowly, something wary creeping back into her expression, the same wariness he had not seen in nearly 2 weeks. "I cannot attend a house party as your guest," she said. "It would confirm every rumor already circulating about the two of us, and it would ruin whatever remains of my reputation entirely. You are already living under my roof. The rumors exist whether you attend or not. I would rather you attend as someone under my protection than remain here alone while I am elsewhere, unable to see to your safety. I do not require your protection, Your Grace." "No," Julian agreed, "but I find I require the peace of mind of knowing where you are. Call it a personal weakness if you like." Eve studied him for a long moment, the shears still frozen in her hand, a single rose stem half cut. Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she finally looked back down at the flowers and said, quietly, "Very well. But if anyone asks, I am attending as a family friend, nothing more." Naturally. The Winterbourne estate, when they arrived a week later, was already crowded with carriages, and laughter spilling out from every open window. Eve stood beside Julian in the entrance hall, dressed in a gown that Lady Margaret had insisted on having tailored for the occasion, her hair arranged more elaborately than Julian had yet seen it, and for a moment he found himself simply looking at her rather than moving forward into the crowd. "You are staring," she murmured. "I am observing. There is a difference." "Is there? You look as though you belong here," Julian said, which was not quite what he meant, though he could not immediately find better words for what he did mean. Eve's mouth twitched, almost a smile, and then the moment passed as Lady Winterbourne descended upon them both, with the particular enthusiasm of a hostess greeting her most interesting guests of the evening. The first hours passed pleasantly enough. Eve was introduced to a dozen unfamiliar faces, most of whom regarded her with polite curiosity rather than open suspicion, and Julian found himself relaxing slightly, allowing himself to believe the evening might pass without incident. He was wrong. He noticed Crane the moment the man entered the card room, laughing loudly at something one of the other gentlemen had said, a glass already in his hand, though the evening had barely begun. Julian's entire body went rigid. He had not expected Crane to be present at all, had assumed the man would have the sense to avoid any gathering where his own conduct might be discussed. He should have known better. Eve saw him at nearly the same moment. Julian watched the color drain from her face, watched her hand tighten around the fan she had been carrying. The delicate ivory sticks pressed hard against her palm. "We should leave the room," Julian said quietly. "I am not leaving a room because of him," Eve said, though her voice had gone tight and thin. "I have spent enough of my life leaving rooms because of men like him." But her hand did not loosen on the fan, and when Crane's gaze swept across the room and landed on her, recognition flickering across his face, Julian saw something in Eve's posture shift, some old and practiced instinct rising up to brace her against whatever came next. Crane approached with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life been told no in a way that mattered. "Miss Thorne," he said, his voice warm and false in equal measure, "what a delightful surprise. I had heard you were staying at Rendham Hall. I did not realize the arrangement was quite so permanent." "It is not an arrangement, Mr. Crane," Eve said, her voice carefully level. "I am a guest." "Of course. A guest." Crane's smile widened, and he stepped closer, close enough that Eve's hand tightened further on the fan. "Though I do wonder what your father would make of the situation. God rest him, given the debts he left behind. I understand there is still quite a sum owing. Perhaps we might discuss it privately, for old time's sake." "There is nothing to discuss." "I think there is a great deal to discuss." Crane reached out, as though to take her elbow and guide her toward the side of the room, the same casual, proprietary gesture Julian had seen him use once before, in a corridor 3 weeks earlier. The moment his fingers touched her sleeve, something in Eve broke loose. Her free hand shot out to the nearest surface, a small side table holding a stranger's discarded fan, and she gripped it so hard that one of the delicate ivory sticks cracked audibly beneath her fingers. Her breath had gone short and fast. For a moment, she was not standing in a crowded card room at all. She was somewhere else entirely, some room from years past that Julian could only guess at, and her whole body had gone rigid with the effort of staying present. Julian moved before he had fully decided to. "Mr. Crane," he said, and his voice carried across the room with a coldness that made several nearby conversations stop entirely. "Remove your hand from her sleeve, or I will remove it for you, and I promise you will not enjoy the manner in which I do so." Crane's hand withdrew immediately, though his expression remained carefully composed, the smile still fixed in place even as his eyes flickered with something closer to alarm. "Your Grace, I did not realize you took such a personal interest in the lady's affairs." "I take a personal interest in men who corner women in private rooms and then attempt the same tactic in public ones, believing a crowd will somehow make the behavior more acceptable rather than less." Julian's voice remained perfectly level, perfectly cold, the tone of a man reading out a debt that had finally come due. "You will leave this house tonight. You will not attend another gathering where Miss Thorne is present. And if I hear that you have spoken her name to a single soul in this county, in any context, I will make certain that every door in London closes to you before the week is out. I have the means to do it, and after tonight, I assure you I have the inclination as well." The room had gone entirely silent. Several of the other gentlemen had turned to watch, and Lady Winterbourne herself had appeared in the doorway, her face pale with the realization that her evening was about to become the subject of gossip for months to come. Crane's composure finally cracked. "You cannot simply—" "I can, And I have. Good evening, Mr. Crane. Crane left within the half hour, his carriage summoned with visible haste, and the party resumed its noise and laughter within minutes, as parties always do, the incident already being folded into whispered conversation and half-formed rumor by the time the musicians struck up the next set. Julian found Eve alone on the terrace outside, the cracked fan still clutched in her hand, her breathing finally beginning to slow. "Are you unharmed?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was not one of gratitude, as he had perhaps expected, but of something sharper, something closer to anger. "I did not ask you to defend me," she said, her voice tight and clipped. "I did not ask to be your project, Julian. I am capable of managing my own affairs, and I would appreciate it if you would stop treating me as though I require rescuing every time a man behaves badly in my presence." Julian absorbed this without flinching, though something in his chest tightened at the accusation. "I did not intervene because I believe you incapable," he said. "I intervened because I was standing close enough to see what was happening, and I would not have been able to live with myself had I simply watched it unfold without acting. That is not the same as respecting my ability to handle it myself." "No," Julian admitted. "It is not. You are right to be angry about that." Eve stared at him, clearly having expected an argument rather than agreement, and something in her posture wavered, the anger still present, but no longer quite so sharp at the edges. "I am tired," she said finally, quieter now, "of being something men decide requires managing. First my father's debts, then Crane, now you, however well-intentioned you may be." "I understand," Julian said. "I will try to remember, in the future, to ask before I act, rather than assuming my judgment is the only one that matters in a room." Eve looked at him for a long moment, something in her expression softening despite herself. "That is a rather large promise for a duke who is used to being obeyed without argument." "I am attempting to become a slightly less efficient man," Julian said. "It is proving more difficult than I expected." Something that might have been a laugh escaped her then, small and surprised, and for a moment the tension between them eased into something else entirely, something neither of them examined too closely as they stood together on the terrace, the noise of the party continuing behind them, neither quite ready to return to it. They did not speak of Crane again that night, but when they returned to Rendham Hall 2 days later, Eve carried the cracked fan with her, tucked carefully into her traveling case, as though even a broken thing could be worth keeping, provided it had survived something worth surviving. Autumn settled over Rendham Hall slowly, the gardens turning gold and brown, and with it came a restlessness in Julian that he could not quite name, though he suspected Eve was at the center of it. He had begun, without entirely meaning to, keeping a private accounting of her father's remaining debts, gathered through careful and discreet inquiries with solicitors in London who knew better than to ask why a duke wanted such information. The sum, when he finally had it in full, was substantial but not impossible. He could clear it within a single transaction, quietly, without anyone beyond his own solicitor ever knowing the details. He decided to do exactly that on a cold evening in late October, calling Eve into his study after supper under the pretense of discussing household matters. She arrived in a simple gray dress, her hair loosely pinned, and settled into the chair across from his desk with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent the past 2 months learning this room as well as her own. "You wish to speak with me," she said. "I did." Julian slid a folded document across the desk toward her, along with a bank draft he had prepared earlier that afternoon. "I have looked into your father's remaining debts. This should settle them entirely." Eve did not reach for the papers. She simply looked at them, then at him, her expression unreadable. "You had no right to look into my father's affairs without my knowledge," she said quietly. "I am aware. I did it regardless, because I could not think of another way to help you that you would not immediately refuse. And you assumed I would accept money from you instead. I assumed," Julian said carefully, "that clearing a debt is a simple transaction, nothing more. You would owe me nothing beyond the courtesy of accepting help when it is offered freely. Eve was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving from the papers to his face and back again, something working behind her expression that Julian could not fully read. "You are not paying a debt, Julian," she said finally, her voice very soft. "You are trying to buy a reason for me to stay." The words landed in the room like something physical, heavy enough that Julian felt them settle into his chest before he had fully processed their meaning. "That is not," he started, and then stopped, because the denial would not come, because some part of him recognized the truth of what she had said even before he had allowed himself to examine it directly. "If you simply wished to clear my father's debts out of kindness, you would have done it quietly, through your solicitor, and never told me at all," Eve continued, her voice steady now, gaining confidence as she spoke. "You would not have called me into this room and placed the papers directly in front of me, waiting to see what I would do with them. You wanted me to know, you wanted me to understand what you were offering, and why." Julian said nothing. He sat very still, his hands flat on the desk on either side of the papers, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself entirely without a response prepared. "I have watched you retreat to these ledgers every time something felt too large to manage with words alone," Eve said, gentler now, though no less direct. "I understand that better than you might think, but you cannot solve this the way you solve everything else, Julian. You cannot make a column of numbers balance and call the feeling settled." "What would you have me do instead?" Julian asked, and his voice, when it emerged, sounded rougher than he intended, stripped of its usual careful control. Eve did not answer immediately. She rose from her chair, crossed to where the ledger book still lay open on the corner of his desk, its neat columns of figures stretching back years, and closed it gently, the way she had once before, without asking permission. "You would have to say it," she said quietly. "Whatever it is, without the numbers to hide behind." Julian stared at the closed ledger, then at her, and for a long moment the study held nothing but silence, the fire crackling low in the grate, the autumn wind pressing gently against the window pane. "I do not want you to leave," he said finally, the words coming slowly, each one costing him something. "Not because I feel responsible for you, and not because clearing a debt is a kindness owed to a guest. I do not want you to leave because this house has felt different since you arrived in it, in a way I do not entirely know how to explain, and I am not certain I know how to return to the way it felt before." Eve's hands had gone still against the closed cover of the ledger. She did not look at him, not immediately, her gaze fixed instead on some point beyond the window, on the darkening garden outside. "I do not know how to want something and expect it will not be taken from me," she said finally, so quietly, Julian nearly missed it entirely. "Every time I have allowed myself to want anything, it has cost me more than I could afford to lose. My father's title, my mother's health, my own sense of safety in a room. I do not know how to let myself want this without bracing for the moment it disappears." "I cannot promise you nothing will ever go wrong," Julian said. "I am not certain anyone can promise that, however much they might wish to, but I can promise that I am not offering you a transaction. I am not trying to purchase a reason for you to stay. I am simply telling you that I would like you to choose to, if choosing is something you find yourself able to do." Eve turned to face him fully then, her eyes bright in the firelight, something fragile and unguarded moving across her expression that Julian had not seen from her before, not even in the quietest moments of the past 2 months. "I need time," she said. "Not because I do not feel something in return, because I have spent so long protecting myself that I no longer entirely trust my own instincts when it comes to safety. I need to be certain that what I feel for you is not simply gratitude wearing the shape of something larger." "Take whatever time you require," Julian said. "I am not going anywhere." He did not push the bank draft toward her again. He simply left it on the desk between them, untouched, and after a long moment, Eve nodded once, turned, and left the study without another word. Julian sat alone in the silence afterward, staring at the closed ledger, and found that for the first time in 4 years, he had no desire whatsoever to open it again that night. The following days passed with a careful, quiet distance between them, not unkind, but deliberate, both of them navigating the new and uncertain territory that had opened between them in that study. Eve took to spending long hours in the garden despite the cold, wrapped in a heavy shawl, and Julian found himself watching her from his study window more often than he would have admitted to anyone. It was Lady Margaret, returning for her promised visit a week later, who finally broke the tension between them with her usual lack of subtlety. "You are both behaving like a pair of nervous schoolchildren," she announced over dinner, looking between her nephew and Eve with open exasperation. "Julian has not managed a coherent sentence in my presence for the better part of an hour, and Miss Thorne has rearranged the same flower arrangement 3 times since I arrived. Whatever occurred between the two of you, I suggest you resolve it before I am forced to intervene directly, and I promise you neither of you will enjoy my methods." Eve's cheeks colored, and Julian found himself, for once, entirely without a witty response prepared. "It is a private matter, Aunt Margaret," he managed finally. "Everything in this house is a private matter until it is not," Lady Margaret said. "I have buried one husband and outlived 2 sisters. Julian, I have very little patience remaining for young people who cannot simply say what they mean to one another." She turned her attention to Eve directly. "Do you care for my nephew, Miss Thorne? A simple yes or no will suffice." Eve's hand stilled in her lap. Julian watched her, his own breath caught somewhere in his chest, waiting. "Yes," Eve said finally, quietly but without hesitation. "I do." "Good," Lady Margaret said, returning to her soup as though the matter were now entirely settled. "Then I suggest the two of you stop wasting my remaining patience and resolve whatever foolishness stands between you and simply saying so to each other directly." Julian looked across the table at Eve, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that neither of them needed words to confirm, though neither of them spoke further on the matter that evening, both apparently content to let the truth settle quietly between them until they were ready to act on it fully. Word came from London within the fortnight that Eve's father's remaining creditors had been quietly satisfied, not through Julian's bank draft, which still sat untouched in the drawer of his desk, but through a modest inheritance from a distant relation that Eve had not even known existed, a small estate in the north that had passed to her through a cousin's death months earlier, the papers only now catching up to her after months of delay through the courts. It was, Julian thought when he heard the news, a strange kind of mercy. It meant that whatever happened next between them would happen without the shadow of debt or obligation hovering over it. It meant that if Eve chose to stay, she would be choosing him and nothing else. She told him the news herself, in the garden, on a bright cold morning with frost still clinging to the last of the fallen leaves. "I no longer require your generosity," she said, though there was no sharpness in it now, only a kind of quiet relief. "The debts are settled. My own means, however modest, are sufficient to make my own way from here, should I choose to." "Should you choose to," Julian repeated carefully. "Does that mean you have not yet decided?" Eve was quiet for a moment, her breath visible in the cold air, her eyes fixed on some middle distance beyond the garden wall. "I have decided a great many things," she said finally. "I have decided that I no longer wish to make myself small enough to avoid being noticed. I have decided that anger, when it comes, is not something I need to be ashamed of, that it has kept me safe more than once when nothing else could. I have decided that grief, whether mine or yours, does not need to be managed in silence to be survived." She turned to look at him directly. "What I have not yet decided is whether I am ready to trust that what I feel for you will not eventually cost me everything, the way every other thing I have ever wanted has." "I cannot answer that for you," Julian said. "I can only tell you that I intend to remain exactly as steady as I have been these past months, for as long as it takes you to decide." Eve studied him for a long moment, something searching in her expression, and then, unexpectedly, she smiled, small and genuine, the first truly unguarded smile Julian had seen from her since the night he found her on his windowsill. "That is a very patient offer," she said, "for a man who once told me efficiency was his worst quality. I told you I was attempting to become less efficient. I did not say the attempt was easy. She left for London 3 days later, to see to the small estate that had come to her, to settle its affairs and decide, in her own time and without Julian's presence to influence her, what she truly wanted from the rest of her life. Julian did not ask her to stay. He did not send letters demanding her return, though he wrote to her twice during the 6 weeks she was gone, careful letters about nothing important: the weather, the state of the gardens, his aunt's continuing efforts to marry off half the county before winter set in fully. Eve wrote back each time, her letters growing gradually less careful, gradually more like conversation, until by the 5th exchange she was writing to him about her days in full, the small estate she had inherited, the strange freedom of managing her own household for the first time in her life, the loneliness of evenings spent without anyone across the table from her. It was in her final letter, arriving in mid-December with the first true snow of the season, that she told him she was returning to Rendham Hall, though she gave no explanation beyond a single line near the close of the page. I find I have grown accustomed to being looked at, provided it is you doing the looking. Julian read that line perhaps a dozen times before he allowed himself to believe it fully. She arrived on Equation in late December, nearly 4 months after the night he had first found her on his windowsill, and the household staff, who had grown fond of her during her months at the Hall, greeted her return with an enthusiasm that made her laugh for the first time in what felt like weeks. Margot the housemaid nearly wept with relief. Lady Margaret, arriving for her own Christmas visit 2 days later, declared the entire household considerably improved by her presence, and demanded to know when a wedding might be expected, a question Eve deflected with practiced humor, and Julian answered with nothing more than a private, satisfied silence. But it was on the last night of the year that the true resolution came, quiet and unplanned, the way the most important things often are. Eve had gone up to her room earlier than usual, tired from the day's festivities, and Julian had remained below in his study for another hour, working through correspondence that had piled up over the holiday, before finally making his way toward his own chambers well past midnight. He heard the sound before he reached his door, the scrape of fabric against stone, the particular creak of a window being worked open from the inside. For a moment, his heart seized with something close to fear, an old instinct rising up before reason could catch it, some part of him convinced that history was repeating itself, that something had gone wrong, that Eve was fleeing something in the night, the way she had fled Crane 4 months earlier. He reached his own window, just as she was climbing through it from the outside ledge, having apparently made her way along the same stone path she had once used to escape, moving in the opposite direction this time, toward his room rather than away from it. She froze the moment she saw him, one leg still over the sill, snow dusting her shoulders, her hair coming loose the exact same way it had the very first night he had found her there. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "This seems familiar," Julian said finally, his voice caught somewhere between alarm and disbelief. "I wanted to see if it still worked," Eve said, slightly breathless, though this time there was no fear in it, only something bright and reckless that Julian had never quite seen from her before. The ledge. "I wanted to know if I could still do it, after everything. You could have simply used the door." "I know." She smiled, the same small, unguarded smile from the garden months earlier, now fuller, more certain. "But I thought it seemed right, somehow, to come back the same way I first appeared. Full circle, as it were." Julian crossed the room slowly, close enough now that he could see the frost clinging to her eyelashes, the flush of cold on her cheeks. "The last time you were on that ledge," he said quietly, "you told me you were in the wrong room." "I was wrong about that," Eve said. "I have thought about it a great deal these past months. In London, in that empty house with no one across the table from me, I was not in the wrong room that night. I simply had not yet understood that I had found the right one." Julian reached out then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished to, and helped her the rest of the way through the window, her hand cold in his, steady, despite the height and the dark, and the snow still falling softly outside. "I have something to ask you," he said, once she was standing safely inside, "and I find I no longer wish to ask it through letters, or through careful conversations in gardens, or through anything that leaves room for either of us to retreat into silence afterward." Eve's breath caught, visible in the cold air of the room, her eyes wide and steady on his face. "Then ask it plainly," she said. "Marry me," Julian said, without preamble, without the careful diplomatic phrasing he might once have used, the words simple and direct, in a way that surprised even him. "Not because of debts settled or reputations protected, not because I feel some duty toward you as a man of standing, simply because I cannot imagine another winter in this house without you standing exactly where you are standing now." Eve was quiet for a long moment, snow still melting slowly in her hair, her hand still resting in his. "I once told you," she said finally, "that I did not know how to want something without bracing for the moment it would be taken from me. I remember. I find," she continued, her voice growing steadier with each word, "that I am tired of bracing. I find I would rather want this fully and risk whatever comes than spend the rest of my life protecting myself from a happiness I have already found." "Is that a yes?" Julian asked, and for the first time since she had known him, his voice carried something unguarded and almost hopeful, entirely without its usual careful control. "That is a yes," Eve said, and the smile that broke across her face then was nothing like the careful, guarded expressions she had worn during her first weeks in this house. It was open and bright and entirely unafraid. Julian did not kiss her immediately. He simply stood there, holding her cold hand in his warm one, letting the moment settle fully between them, the fire in his grate burning low, the snow still falling softly beyond the window he had once closed with her still standing inside it. Outside, the last hours of the old year slipped quietly into the new one, unnoticed by either of them, both far too occupied with the far more important business of finally, after 4 long months, choosing each other without hesitation or doubt. The following spring, the wedding was held in the gardens of Rendham Hall, the same gardens where Eve had once cut roses with trembling hands and made her first quiet decisions about the life she wanted to build. Lady Margaret wept openly through the entire ceremony, despite loudly insisting beforehand that she would do no such thing. Margot the housemaid stood among the household staff with tears of her own, having long ago appointed herself the unofficial guardian of the entire romance from its very first uncertain days. And when the ceremony ended, and the guests began to make their way toward the house for the wedding breakfast, Eve paused for a moment beside the garden wall, looking back toward the window on the 3rd floor, the one she had once climbed out of in fear, and climbed back into in hope. Julian, beside her, followed her gaze, and understood immediately what she was looking at. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Eve shook her head, slipped her hand into his, and looked at him with the same steady certainty that had carried her through every difficult choice of the past year. She had spent so long learning how to leave rooms quietly, how to vanish before anyone noticed her at all. In the end, she had learned something far more difficult and far more worth learning. She chose the door,